Welcome back to the Jesus Stories channel. Today's new story is The Untold Story of Titus, the man missing from Acts. Please support the channel with a like and subscribe. The content of this video has been carefully compiled from various sources, so if there are any missing details or inaccuracies, please feel free to leave a comment and share your additional insights. Thank you. And now, let's begin the story.
For most people, Titus is little more than a name buried in the pages of the New Testament. No dramatic conversion story, no famous miracles, no sermons recorded for history. And yet, behind some of the most important turning points of early Christianity, stood a man Paul trusted when almost no one else could be trusted. He was a Gentile at the center of a theological battle that would shape the future of the Christian faith. He was sent into churches torn apart by conflict, division, and controversy. He carried messages, restored relationships, defended the gospel, and helped build communities that would survive long after the apostles were gone. So, who was Titus? How did a Greek convert become one of the most influential leaders of the first century church? And why does the New Testament reveal so little about a man who played such a crucial role in its story? To answer those questions, we must uncover the complete story of Titus, the forgotten architect behind some of Christianity's most decisive moments. When most people think about the major figures of the New Testament, certain names immediately come to mind. Peter, the bold disciple who preached at Pentecost. John, whose writings would shape Christian theology for centuries. James, the respected leader of the Jerusalem church. And Paul, the missionary whose journeys carried the message of Jesus across the Roman world. Yet hidden behind these famous names stands a man who played a surprisingly important role in some of the most decisive moments of early Christian history. His name was Titus. Unlike Peter, Titus left behind no recorded sermons. Unlike Paul, he wrote no surviving New Testament books. Unlike Timothy, he receives relatively little attention in modern Christian discussions. In fact, one of the most surprising facts about Titus is that he never appears in the Book of Acts at all. This absence has puzzled historians, biblical scholars, and attentive readers for generations. How could one of Paul's closest associates be completely missing from the very book that records much of Paul's ministry? The question becomes even more fascinating when we consider what the New Testament does reveal. Although Titus is absent from Acts, he appears repeatedly in Paul's letters during some of the most critical episodes of the apostolic age. He is present during the controversy over Gentile inclusion. He is entrusted with delicate missions involving troubled churches. He is assigned leadership responsibilities across entire regions. He is described with unusual warmth and confidence by Paul himself. In other words, the man missing from the narrative of Acts somehow emerges as one of the most trusted leaders in Paul's missionary network. This apparent contradiction forms one of the great historical mysteries surrounding Titus. Before exploring the theories behind that mystery, it is important to understand the limits of our evidence. Everything we know with reasonable certainty about Titus comes primarily from a small collection of New Testament texts, especially Galatians, 2 Corinthians, the Epistle to Titus, and a brief reference in 2 Timothy. Unlike Peter or Paul, whose activities are documented across multiple sources, Titus appears only in scattered references. Historians therefore face the challenge of reconstructing his life from fragments. This is not unusual in ancient history. Many influential figures are known only through brief mentions preserved in surviving documents. The absence of information does not necessarily indicate a lack of importance. Sometimes it simply reflects the realities of historical preservation. Ancient records were limited. Manuscripts were lost, and authors often focused on specific purposes rather than comprehensive biographies. The Book of Acts itself illustrates this principle, written by Luke. Acts does not attempt to document every important Christian leader of the first century. Instead, it follows a carefully structured narrative focused primarily on the spread of the gospel from Jerusalem to the wider Roman world. Even within that framework, many significant individuals receive little attention or disappear entirely after brief appearances. This observation has led scholars to propose several explanations for Titus's absence. Some suggest Luke may have omitted him because Titus's story was closely connected to controversies Luke chose not to emphasize. Others argue that Luke simply selected certain companions of Paul while leaving out others due to the narrative focus of his work. Still others believe Titus may have operated in regions or circumstances that fell outside Luke's primary interests. The truth is that no explanation can be proven with certainty. What matters is recognizing that absence from Acts does not equal insignificance. If anything, the letters of Paul suggest the opposite. Titus appears repeatedly in situations where trust, maturity, and leadership were essential. This realization forces us to look at Titus differently. Rather than viewing him as a minor figure because he receives limited attention, we should view him as a figure whose importance must be measured by the responsibilities he carried. Throughout the surviving evidence, Titus consistently appears in moments of extraordinary significance. He was not simply a messenger transporting letters between cities. He was not merely an assistant performing administrative tasks. Again and again, Paul entrusted him with assignments involving theological controversy, church conflict, leadership development, and organizational responsibility. These were the kinds of tasks given only to individuals whose judgment had been tested and whose character had earned confidence. Understanding this context also helps us appreciate the world in which Titus lived. The Christianity of the first century was very different from the global religion familiar today. There were no church buildings dominating city skylines, no formal denominations, no centralized administrative structures connecting congregations across continents. Christian communities were small, vulnerable, and often scattered throughout major urban centers of the Roman Empire. Communication depended on letters carried by travelers. Leadership depended heavily on personal relationships and trust. The survival of the movement required capable individuals who could represent apostolic teaching in places where the apostles themselves could not remain. Titus appears to have been one of those individuals. Yet, despite his importance, many details of his life remain unknown. The New Testament does not tell us where he was born. It does not identify his parents. It does not describe his education. It does not record the moment he first met Paul. It does not explain how he came to faith in Christ. Modern readers often find these gaps frustrating, but they also remind us of an important principle. Responsible historical investigation must distinguish between evidence and speculation. The goal is not to fill silence with imagination. The goal is to understand what the sources actually allow us to know, and what they allow us to know is already remarkable. When the scattered references are assembled together, a consistent picture emerges. Titus was a trusted co-worker. He was a skilled leader. He was a bridge between different communities. He was a problem solver in moments of crisis. Most importantly, he stood at the center of several developments that would help determine the future shape of Christianity itself. This is why his story deserves attention. The history of the early church was not built solely by the apostles whose names dominate the biblical narrative. It was also built by leaders who worked behind the scenes, strengthening churches, resolving conflicts, and carrying responsibility across vast distances. Titus represents one of the finest examples of that kind of leadership. His life reminds us that some of the most influential people in history are not always the most visible. They are often the individuals trusted when decisions matter most. As we begin tracing the complete story of Titus, We are not simply examining the biography of a forgotten companion of Paul. We are exploring the story of a man who stood at the crossroads of some of Christianity's most important turning points. From debates that would define the gospel's relationship to the Gentile world, to crises that threatened the unity of major churches, to the development of leadership structures that would help Christianity survive beyond the apostolic generation. Titus was there, and although his name rarely appears in the spotlight, the evidence suggests that the growth of the early church would have looked very different without him. To understand why Titus would eventually become one of the most important figures in early Christianity, we must first understand the world into which he entered. Long before Titus became a trusted leader, before he helped resolve church crises, before he organized major missions across the Roman world, he represented something far more controversial. He was a Gentile believer in a movement that was still overwhelmingly Jewish. This fact may seem ordinary today, because Christianity eventually became a global faith composed largely of non-Jewish believers. But in the middle of the 1st century, the situation looked very different. The earliest followers of Jesus were Jews. Jesus himself was Jewish. The 12 apostles were Jewish. The first church in Jerusalem was Jewish. The scriptures they read were Jewish. The traditions they inherited were Jewish. In the minds of many people during those early decades, belief in Jesus was not viewed as a separate religion. It was understood as a movement emerging from within Judaism. As a result, the arrival of Gentile converts raised questions that would challenge some of the deepest assumptions of the age. Unfortunately, the New Testament provides very little direct information about Titus's early life. We are not told where he was born. We do not know who his parents were. We know nothing about his childhood, education, occupation, or social status. Yet, one detail preserved by Paul is enormously important. In Galatians, Titus is identified as a Greek. That single description tells us more than it may appear at first glance. It places Titus within the wider Gentile world of the Eastern Roman Empire, a world shaped by Greek language, culture, philosophy, and social customs. During the 1st century, Greek culture remained deeply influential throughout the Mediterranean. Although Rome controlled the empire politically, Greek language served as a common means of communication across vast regions. Cities throughout Asia Minor, Greece, Syria, and beyond shared elements of Hellenistic culture that had spread centuries earlier through the conquests of Alexander the Great. Titus most likely grew up within that environment. He would have been familiar with traditions, values, and assumptions very different from those of observant Jewish communities. He would not have been raised under the covenant obligations of the Mosaic Law. He would not have practiced circumcision. He would not have followed Jewish dietary regulations. He would not have participated in the festivals and rituals that shaped Jewish identity. In the eyes of many Jews during the period, he would have been considered an outsider to the covenant people of God. This distinction is crucial because Jewish identity in the 1st century was not merely a matter of ethnicity. It involved covenant membership, religious practice, historical memory, and communal belonging. The Jewish people understood themselves as participants in a unique relationship with the God of Israel. Circumcision, Sabbath observance, dietary laws, and other practices served as visible markers of that covenant identity. These customs had been preserved through centuries of conquest, exile, foreign domination, and cultural pressure. For many Jews, maintaining these distinctions was an act of faithfulness. The arrival of large numbers of Gentiles into the Christian movement therefore created a genuine dilemma. How could individuals who lacked these covenant markers become part of God's people? The question was not driven solely by prejudice or hostility. It emerged from deeply rooted theological convictions and centuries of religious tradition. Into this environment stepped Titus. At some point, likely through Paul's ministry or through connections within the growing Gentile mission, Titus became a follower of Jesus Christ. The details of his conversion remain unknown, but its significance cannot be overstated. His decision to embrace the gospel placed him within a rapidly expanding movement that was already beginning to transform the religious landscape of the Roman world. More importantly, his conversion would eventually force Christian leaders to confront questions they could no longer avoid. The significance of Titus becomes clearer when viewed against the broader mission of Paul. Unlike some early believers who focused primarily on Jewish communities, Paul devoted much of his ministry to reaching Gentiles. As he traveled across the Roman Empire, he witnessed something remarkable. People from diverse ethnic, cultural, and social backgrounds were responding to the message of Christ. Greeks, Romans, Syrians, Asians, and others were becoming believers without first adopting Jewish identity. To Paul, this was evidence that God himself was opening the door of salvation to the nations. Yet not everyone interpreted these developments in the same way. Some believers welcomed Gentile converts, but believed they should also adopt the traditional covenant markers of Judaism. From their perspective, faith in Jesus fulfilled the story of Israel rather than replacing it. Therefore, they reasoned, Gentiles entering God's people should embrace the practices that had defined God's covenant community for centuries. This disagreement would soon become one of the most important controversies in Christian history. What makes Titus especially significant is that he was not merely observing these debates from a distance. He embodied the issue itself. He was exactly the kind of person standing at the center of the controversy. He was a Gentile believer who had come to faith in Christ without becoming Jewish. His existence raised a question that neither side could ignore. If God had already accepted Gentiles through faith, what additional requirements, if any, should be imposed upon them? In many ways, Titus became a living test case for the future of Christianity. Historians often point out that major historical changes frequently become visible through the lives of ordinary individuals. Large theological debates may seem abstract until they affect real people. The story of Titus illustrates this principle perfectly. Behind every discussion about circumcision, covenant identity, and Gentile inclusion stood actual believers seeking to understand their place within God's people. Titus was one of those believers. His life transformed a theoretical argument into a practical reality that church leaders had to address. There is also a deeper irony within this stage of the story. At the time of his conversion, Titus would have appeared unlikely to become one of the most influential leaders in the Christian movement. He possessed none of the obvious credentials that many people might have expected. He was not one of the original disciples. He was not from Jerusalem. He was not part of Israel's covenant heritage. Yet Christianity was already demonstrating one of its most revolutionary ideas. The movement increasingly evaluated people not according to ancestry, status, or social position, but according to faithfulness, character, and calling. Titus would eventually become one of the clearest examples of that transformation. For now, however, the controversy surrounding Gentile believers remained unresolved. The growing success of Paul's mission was forcing the church to answer a question that would determine its future direction. Would Christianity remain closely tied to the ethnic and covenant boundaries of Judaism? Or would it emerge as a global movement capable of embracing people from every nation, without requiring them to become Jewish first? The answer to that question would shape the future of the Christian faith. And when the decisive moment arrived, Titus would find himself standing directly at the center of the storm. By the middle of the 1st century, the rapid growth of the Christian movement had created a question that could no longer be postponed. The gospel was spreading far beyond the boundaries of Judea. Gentiles were coming to faith in increasing numbers. New congregations were appearing across the eastern Mediterranean. What had begun as a movement entirely rooted within Judaism was becoming increasingly diverse. Yet, the faster Christianity expanded, the more urgent a fundamental question became. What exactly was required for a person to become part of God's people? This issue may sound technical to modern audiences, but for the first generation of Christians, it touched the heart of identity, covenant, and salvation itself. The controversy centered on circumcision, a practice deeply embedded within Jewish history. For nearly 2,000 years, circumcision had served as one of the defining signs of the covenant established between God and Abraham. It was more than a religious ritual. It symbolized belonging, heritage, obedience, and participation in the covenant community of Israel. Throughout centuries of foreign domination, exile, and cultural pressure, Jewish families had preserved this practice as a visible expression of their identity. To many believers from Jewish backgrounds, the idea that Gentiles could become part of God's people without embracing such covenant markers seemed difficult to accept. Their concern was not necessarily motivated by hostility toward Gentiles. Many genuinely believed they were defending the continuity of God's covenant promises. From their perspective, if Jesus was Israel's Messiah, then participation in Israel's covenant traditions remained essential. As Gentile converts entered the church, these believers naturally assumed that newcomers should adopt the practices that had long distinguished God's people from surrounding nations. On the other side stood Paul, and many of those involved in the growing Gentile mission. Through years of ministry, Paul had witnessed non-Jewish believers responding to the gospel with genuine faith. He had seen communities transformed by the message of Christ throughout regions far beyond Israel. These experiences convinced him that God was welcoming Gentiles directly through faith in Jesus. Paul believed that the death and resurrection of Christ had inaugurated a new covenant, in which membership among God's people was defined primarily by faith, rather than by ethnic identity or ceremonial observance. If Gentiles were required to become Jews before becoming Christians, Paul feared that the very heart of the gospel would be compromised. This disagreement eventually produced one of the most important theological confrontations in early Christian history. And at the center of that confrontation stood Titus. What makes the story so remarkable is that Titus was not a theologian presenting arguments in a formal debate. He was the living example around which the debate revolved. According to Paul's account in Galatians, Titus accompanied him during a significant visit to Jerusalem. This detail is easy to overlook, but its importance cannot be overstated. Titus was a Greek believer. He had not been circumcised. He represented the precise category of convert that stood at the center of the controversy. The discussion was no longer theoretical. Church leaders were no longer debating hypothetical scenarios. An actual Gentile believer stood before them. Titus had embraced the gospel. Titus was actively serving within the Christian movement. Titus was recognized as a genuine believer. The question was whether anything more was required. Paul's account suggests that pressure existed from certain individuals who believed Titus should undergo circumcision. These figures, whom Paul describes in strongly critical terms, viewed circumcision as a necessary expression of covenant membership. From their perspective, Titus represented an unfinished conversion. Faith in Christ alone was not enough. Additional steps remained necessary. Paul disagreed completely. His response reveals how seriously he viewed the issue. In Galatians, he explains that Titus was not compelled to be circumcised. This statement may appear simple, but its implications were enormous. Paul understood that if Titus submitted to circumcision as a requirement for acceptance before God, it would send a powerful message throughout the Christian world. It would imply that faith alone was insufficient. It would suggest that Gentiles needed to adopt Jewish identity markers in order to belong fully within God's people. Paul believed such a conclusion would fundamentally alter the gospel he preached. Historians often note that major turning points in history sometimes appear surprisingly small at the time. A conversation, a meeting, a decision affecting one individual can eventually influence millions of lives. The case of Titus represents one of those moments. The question was not merely whether one man would undergo a particular ritual. The deeper issue concerned the future direction of Christianity itself. Would the movement remain closely tied to the ethnic boundaries of Judaism? Or would it emerge as a truly international faith capable of embracing people from every nation on equal terms? The outcome would shape everything that followed. Although tensions regarding Gentile inclusion did not disappear overnight, the decision not to compel Titus to be circumcised represented a major victory for Paul's understanding of the gospel. It demonstrated that at least some of the leading figures within the early church recognized the legitimacy of the Gentile mission. The significance of this moment becomes even clearer when viewed from the perspective of later history. Christianity would eventually spread throughout the Roman Empire and far beyond. Millions of believers from countless cultures would enter the faith without adopting Jewish identity. The pathway that made such expansion possible was forged during debates like the one surrounding Titus. Without these decisions, Christianity might have developed in a very different direction. Another important aspect of this episode is what it reveals about Titus himself. Although the spotlight often falls upon Paul during discussions of Galatians, Titus's presence required courage. He found himself standing at the center of a controversy involving some of the most influential leaders in the Christian movement. His identity became the focus of intense debate. His future served as a test case for broader theological questions. Yet, there is no indication that he abandoned his faith or withdrew from ministry. Instead, he remained closely associated with Paul and continued serving within the growing church. This resilience would become a defining characteristic throughout his life. Again and again, Titus would find himself in difficult situations requiring patience, conviction, and maturity. The controversy over circumcision became the first major example. It revealed that he was more than a Gentile convert. He was becoming a trusted participant in some of the most important developments of the apostolic age. By the end of this confrontation, one reality had become increasingly clear. The Christian movement was entering a new phase of history. The gospel was crossing cultural boundaries at a scale few had anticipated. Gentiles were becoming part of the people of God without abandoning their ethnic identity. The implications of this transformation would reshape the future of Christianity. And for Titus, personally, the experience marked the beginning of a deeper relationship with Paul. Having stood together during one of the church's most important theological battles, they would soon work side by side in challenges that required not only doctrinal conviction, but also exceptional leadership. The next stage of Titus's journey would reveal why Paul eventually came to trust him more than almost anyone else in his ministry network. The controversy over circumcision marked a turning point, not only for the future of Christianity, but also for the future of Titus himself. Until that moment, he had primarily appeared as a Gentile convert, whose life carried important theological implications. After that moment, a different picture begins to emerge. The scattered references throughout Paul's letters reveal that Titus was becoming something far more significant. He was developing into one of the most trusted leaders within the apostolic mission. This transformation is one of the most fascinating aspects of his story, because it highlights a reality often overlooked in discussions of early Christianity. The spread of the gospel did not depend solely on famous apostles. It also depended on capable men and women who could be entrusted with responsibility, represent apostolic teaching, and strengthen communities across the Roman world. Titus would become one of the finest examples of such leadership. One of the challenges in reconstructing this stage of Titus's life is that the New Testament never tells us exactly when his relationship with Paul began. We are not given the story of their first meeting. We do not know where Titus first encountered the apostle. We are not told how long they worked together before appearing in the surviving letters. Yet the evidence allows us to draw an important conclusion. By the time Titus emerges clearly in the historical record, he had already earned an extraordinary level of confidence from Paul. This confidence did not develop overnight. In the ancient world, trust was often built through shared travel, common hardships, difficult decisions, and proven faithfulness over time. Titus appears to have passed those tests. The language Paul uses when speaking about him provides some of the strongest evidence. In the epistle to Titus, Paul refers to him as his true son in a common faith. This phrase carried significant meaning within the first century. It did not suggest a biological relationship. Instead, it reflected a bond formed through spiritual mentorship, shared mission, and deep personal trust. Ancient teachers often described their closest disciples in familial terms because education involved much more than transferring information. It involved shaping character, worldview, and leadership. Paul's description indicates that Titus belonged among the individuals he had personally invested in and prepared for future responsibility. This observation becomes even more significant when compared with the broader network of people surrounding Paul. Throughout his ministry, Paul worked alongside many companions. Barnabas played a crucial role during the early missionary journeys. Silas traveled extensively with him. Luke documented portions of the mission and remained a loyal associate. Timothy became one of his closest co-workers. Priscilla and Aquila contributed significantly to the spread of Christianity. Yet, within this diverse network, only a small number of individuals consistently appear as trusted representatives capable of acting on Paul's behalf. Titus belonged to that select group. This distinction matters because Paul's mission was expanding rapidly. Churches were emerging across multiple provinces of the Roman Empire. New believers required instruction. Congregations needed encouragement. Problems demanded solutions. Paul could not personally remain in every city where he had preached. The future of the movement depended upon reliable leaders who could carry responsibility into regions where the apostles themselves could not stay permanently. Titus increasingly became one of those leaders. Another important clue appears in the way Paul speaks about partnership. In 2 Corinthians, Titus is described as Paul's partner and fellow worker. These words reveal more than friendship. They suggest shared responsibility in advancing the mission of the gospel. Paul was not describing Titus as a subordinate who merely followed instructions. Rather, he was recognizing him as a trusted collaborator whose efforts contributed directly to the success of the mission. Such recognition carried considerable weight because Paul was not known for distributing praise carelessly. Throughout his letters, he often challenged weak leadership, confronted error, and warned against individuals who undermined the gospel. The respect he expressed toward Titus, therefore, reflects genuine confidence rather than polite encouragement. Historians studying leadership within the early church frequently note that the apostolic movement faced a unique challenge. The original witnesses of Jesus would not live forever. If Christianity was to survive beyond the first generation, new leaders needed to be identified, trained, and entrusted with authority. This process was already underway during Paul's lifetime. Titus represents one of the clearest examples of that transition. He was part of a rising generation of Christian leaders who would help carry the movement forward after the apostles were gone. What qualities might have made Titus so valuable? Although the New Testament never provides a direct list, the evidence points toward several possibilities. First, He appears to have possessed exceptional reliability. Paul repeatedly involved him in matters of considerable importance. Such responsibility would have been impossible without trustworthiness. Second, Titus seems to have demonstrated emotional maturity. The assignments later entrusted to him often involved people, relationships, and complex situations. Leaders lacking patience or wisdom rarely succeed in such environments. Third, he appears to have possessed theological stability. Having stood alongside Paul during the controversy over Gentile inclusion, Titus understood the core convictions shaping the apostolic mission. Finally, he likely possessed strong interpersonal skills, the ability to communicate effectively, build trust, and work with diverse communities would prove essential throughout his ministry. Another fascinating aspect of Titus's development involves what it reveals about leadership in early Christianity. Unlike many institutions in the ancient world, the Church increasingly elevated individuals based on character and faithfulness, rather than ancestry or social rank. Titus himself demonstrates this principle. He was not one of the original disciples. He was not from Jerusalem. He was not part of Israel's traditional covenant community. Yet, none of those factors prevented him from rising into positions of significant influence. Christianity was gradually creating a leadership culture in which commitment to Christ mattered more than inherited status. For a movement operating within the highly stratified society of the Roman Empire, this represented a remarkable shift. As Titus matured within Paul's circle, he also became evidence that the gospel was accomplishing exactly what it proclaimed. Earlier, controversies had focused on whether Gentiles truly belonged among God's people. Now, a Gentile believer was becoming one of the most trusted leaders in the apostolic mission. The transformation was profound. Titus no longer appeared primarily as the subject of theological debate. He had become a leader helping shape the future of the church itself. Yet the greatest tests of his leadership still lay ahead. Up to this point, the New Testament has shown us why Paul trusted Titus. What it has not yet shown is how that trust would be tested. The answer would emerge in one of the most troubled congregations of the first century, located in one of the most influential cities of the Roman world. The church at Corinth was entering a period of conflict, division, and instability. The situation would demand extraordinary wisdom. Paul needed someone capable of entering a fractured community and helping preserve its future. The man he chose for that mission was Titus. If the controversy over circumcision tested the theological foundations of the early church, the crisis at Corinth would test its ability to survive internal division. By the time Titus entered the story of Corinth, the city had already become one of the most important centers of Christianity in the Roman world. Situated on a narrow isthmus connecting mainland Greece with the Peloponnese, Corinth occupied a strategic position that made it a hub of commerce, travel, and cultural exchange. Merchants arrived from every corner of the Mediterranean. Sailors moved constantly through its ports. Wealth flowed through its markets. Philosophers, politicians, laborers, slaves, and entrepreneurs lived side by side within a city known for both prosperity and moral complexity. For Christian missionaries, Corinth represented an extraordinary opportunity. For church leaders, it often became a source of constant concern. Paul had invested significant effort establishing the church there. According to the New Testament, he spent approximately 18 months in Corinth, a relatively long period compared to many of his other ministry locations. During that time, a vibrant Christian community emerged. Yet, the very diversity that made Corinth strategically important also made it vulnerable to conflict. The church consisted of people from dramatically different social, economic, and cultural backgrounds. Some members possessed wealth and influence. Others came from humble circumstances. Some were educated. Others were not. Some had Jewish backgrounds. Many were Gentiles. Bringing such diverse individuals together under a shared identity in Christ was both the strength and the challenge of the Corinthian church. Over time, cracks began to appear. Paul's letters reveal a congregation struggling with multiple forms of division. Members aligned themselves with different leaders and teachers. Rivalries emerged. Questions about authority became increasingly prominent. Disputes over morality, worship practices, spiritual gifts, and theological issues created further tension. In many respects, Corinth became a laboratory, exposing the difficulties of building a unified Christian community within a deeply fragmented society. The gospel had transformed many lives, but old habits, cultural assumptions, and personal ambitions had not disappeared overnight. The situation eventually deteriorated beyond ordinary disagreement. Although the exact sequence of events remains debated among scholars, the evidence preserved in 2 Corinthians suggests that the relationship between Paul and portions of the church became seriously strained. At some point, opposition against Paul appears to have intensified. Certain individuals challenged his authority and questioned his legitimacy as an apostle. Accusations circulated. Trust weakened. Misunderstandings multiplied. What had once been one of Paul's most important churches was now becoming one of his greatest concerns. Historians often note that conflict within emerging movements can be especially dangerous. External opposition may strengthen a group's sense of identity, but internal division strikes at the heart of its unity. The Corinthian crisis illustrates this principle perfectly. The threat facing the church was not Roman persecution or civic hostility. The threat was fragmentation from within. If the situation continued unchecked, the long-term stability of the congregation could be severely damaged. This is what makes the Corinthian crisis such an important chapter in the story of Titus. Up to this point, we have seen him emerge as a trusted co-worker within Paul's ministry network. We have observed his role in one of Christianity's defining theological controversies. We have seen evidence of Paul's confidence in his character and leadership. Yet, none of those experiences fully prepared us for the challenge now unfolding. Corinth represented something different. This was not a debate about doctrine alone. It was a crisis involving relationships, emotions, authority, and community life. Resolving such a situation required more than theological knowledge. It demanded wisdom, patience, and exceptional leadership. One of the most revealing aspects of the Corinthian story is Paul's own reaction. When reading his letters, it is easy to imagine him as a figure of unwavering confidence, constantly moving forward regardless of obstacles. Yet the Corinthian correspondence reveals a more human side. Paul cared deeply about the people he served. Their spiritual well-being mattered to him. Their response to correction mattered to him. The future of the church mattered to him. As tensions increased, so did his concern. The relationship was becoming one of the most emotionally difficult situations of his ministry. At some stage during the crisis, Paul appears to have made what many scholars refer to as a painful visit to Corinth. Although the details remain uncertain, the surviving evidence suggests that the encounter was deeply troubling. Rather than resolving the conflict, it may have exposed the depth of the problems facing the congregation. Following this difficult experience, Paul wrote a severe letter intended to confront the situation directly. That letter itself has not survived, but references within 2 Corinthians indicate that it carried strong warnings and serious appeals for repentance. Sending such a message involved considerable risk. A congregation already struggling with tension could respond defensively. Relationships could deteriorate further. Opposition could harden. The future remained uncertain. This uncertainty is what gives the chapter its dramatic weight. At this point in the story, the outcome is unknown. The church stands at a crossroads. Will the believers respond positively to correction or move further into division? Will reconciliation prove possible? Or will the relationship collapse entirely? Can a congregation fractured by conflict rediscover unity? These questions remained unanswered. What we do know is that Paul recognized the situation required extraordinary attention. Corinth was too important to abandon, yet too unstable to ignore. The crisis demanded careful intervention from someone capable of understanding both the apostles' concerns and the congregation's struggles. Significantly, this chapter ends before that intervention occurs. The focus here is not on the solution, but on the problem itself. Too often, history celebrates successful outcomes without appreciating the uncertainty that existed beforehand. The Corinthians did not know how the story would end. Paul did not know how the story would end. The future of one of the most influential churches in the Roman world remained uncertain. The tensions were real. The wounds were real. The risk of failure was real. Yet it was precisely within such moments that leaders were tested. As the crisis deepened, Paul would eventually turn to one individual whom he believed possessed the maturity, credibility, and wisdom necessary to enter this fractured environment. The trust built over years of shared ministry was about to be placed under its greatest strain. For the first time, Titus would step into the center of a church crisis that threatened the future of an entire Christian community. And what happened next would reveal why he became known as one of the most effective leaders of the apostolic age. When Paul faced the growing crisis in Corinth, he needed more than a messenger. He needed someone capable of entering a deeply divided community, understanding its tensions, communicating difficult truths, and helping rebuild trust where trust had been damaged. This was the moment when years of preparation, experience, and proven character converged in the life of Titus. The challenge before him was unlike anything we have seen so far in his story. Earlier, Titus had stood at the center of a theological controversy concerning Gentile inclusion. That debate involved doctrine, identity, and the future of the Christian movement. Corinth presented a different kind of battlefield. Here, the problem was not primarily theological uncertainty. It was relational fracture. The church was wounded, and wounded communities rarely heal through arguments alone. They require leadership capable of guiding people toward reconciliation. According to the evidence preserved in 2 Corinthians, Titus became exactly that kind of leader. One of the most important details, often overlooked by modern readers, is that Paul never appears to have chosen Titus by accident. Throughout the ancient world, sensitive assignments were entrusted only to individuals who had demonstrated reliability under pressure. By the time of the Corinthian crisis, Titus had already earned a reputation as a trustworthy co-worker. Paul knew his character. He knew his judgment. He knew his ability to work with people. These qualities made him uniquely suited for the mission ahead. While many leaders excel at preaching, administration, or theological instruction, relatively few possess the ability to rebuild damaged relationships. Titus appears to have had that rare gift. The surviving evidence suggests that he carried Paul's concerns to Corinth and helped facilitate a process of reflection and response within the congregation. Although Scripture does not record the details of his conversations, the outcome is clear enough. The church did not collapse. The relationship between Paul and many of the Corinthians began to improve. Repentance occurred. Tensions eased. Trust started to return. The significance of this achievement becomes clearer when viewed from a historical perspective. Reconciliation is often one of the most difficult tasks in leadership. Solving practical problems can be challenging. Resolving doctrinal disagreements can be challenging. Restoring relationships after conflict may be the most difficult challenge of all. Once people feel misunderstood, criticized, betrayed, or wounded, facts alone rarely solve the problem. Emotions become involved. Pride becomes involved. Fear becomes involved. Successful reconciliation requires patience, credibility, and empathy. Titus appears to have brought all three. Paul's own words reveal just how much depended upon the outcome. In 2 Corinthians, he describes a period of intense anxiety while waiting for news from Corinth. He speaks of arriving in Macedonia and finding no rest because he had not yet located Titus. This passage is remarkable because it allows us to glimpse the emotional reality behind apostolic ministry. The great missionary who traveled across the Roman Empire preaching the gospel was not immune to concern. Paul genuinely worried about the future of the Corinthian church. He worried about whether his severe letter had been received positively or negatively. He worried about whether reconciliation remained possible. Most importantly, he waited for Titus to return with answers. This detail tells us something significant about the role Titus played. He was not functioning as a simple courier delivering information. Paul trusted his assessment of the situation. He trusted his judgment. He trusted his ability to understand what was happening within the congregation. In effect, Titus had become Paul's eyes and ears in Corinth. The eventual reunion between Paul and Titus brought immense relief. According to Paul's account, Titus returned with encouraging news. Many members of the church had responded positively. They had taken Paul's concerns seriously. Their affection for him had not disappeared. The possibility of restoration remained alive. Paul's joy in these passages is unmistakable. He repeatedly expresses gratitude not only for the Corinthians' response, but also for the comfort brought through Titus himself. In fact, one of the most striking features of 2 Corinthians is the way Paul speaks about Titus's own experience. Titus was encouraged by what he witnessed. He developed affection for the believers. He experienced joy because of their response. These details suggest that Titus was not acting as a detached intermediary. He had become personally invested in the well-being of the congregation. This investment likely contributed to his effectiveness. People are far more willing to receive correction when they believe it comes from someone who genuinely cares about them. Titus appears to have balanced truth and compassion in a way that allowed healing to occur without compromising conviction. Another important aspect of this story involves the nature of authority in the early church. Modern readers sometimes assume that apostolic authority functioned through commands that were automatically obeyed. The Corinthian crisis demonstrates a more complex reality. Christian leaders often had to persuade, encourage, and restore, rather than simply issue instructions. Authority depended heavily upon trust and relationship. When those relationships weakened, leadership became more difficult. Titus succeeded because he helped rebuild the relational foundations upon which healthy authority depended. Historians frequently observe that movements survive long-term only when they develop mechanisms for resolving internal conflict. Every growing community experiences disagreements. The question is whether those disagreements become destructive or transformative. Corinth could easily have become a cautionary tale of division. Instead, it became an example of reconciliation. Titus played a central role in making that outcome possible. This achievement helps explain why he occupies such an important place in Paul's ministry. Earlier chapters revealed his theological reliability. The events in Corinth revealed something equally valuable. He possessed exceptional relational intelligence. He understood how to navigate tension without escalating it. He knew how to maintain conviction without becoming combative. He could address problems without losing sight of people. These qualities are rare in any generation. They were especially valuable during the fragile years of the early church. The impact of Titus's success extended beyond Corinth itself. The church occupied a strategically important position within the Roman world. Its health influenced the broader mission of Christianity throughout the region. By helping preserve and strengthen this congregation, Titus contributed to the long-term stability of one of the most influential Christian communities of the first century. More importantly, he demonstrated the kind of leadership that would increasingly be needed as Christianity continued to expand. Building churches was important. Preserving unity within them was equally important. By the end of the Corinthian crisis, Titus had firmly established himself as one of the most effective leaders in Paul's circle. He had succeeded where failure could have produced lasting damage. Yet the story was not over. The restored relationship between Paul and the Corinthians soon opened the door for another ambitious undertaking. This new mission would not focus on conflict resolution. Instead, it would focus on unity across the Christian world itself. Once again, Paul would turn to Titus, and once again, he would entrust him with a responsibility carrying consequences far beyond a single church or a single city. The successful reconciliation between Paul and the Corinthian church marked the end of one crisis, but it also opened the door to a much larger opportunity. For the first time in Titus's story, the challenge before him would not involve theological controversy or church conflict. Instead, it would involve something that revealed the true maturity of the Christian movement itself. Could believers separated by geography, culture, ethnicity, and social background genuinely live as one family in Christ? This question stood at the heart of one of the most ambitious projects of the apostolic age, a project known today as the Collection for Jerusalem. While it may initially sound like a simple fundraising effort, its significance extended far beyond financial assistance. In many ways, it became one of the clearest demonstrations of what Christianity claimed to be. To understand why this initiative mattered so much, we must first look toward Jerusalem. Decades after the resurrection of Jesus, Jerusalem remained the symbolic center of the Christian movement. It was the city where the church had begun. It was the location of Pentecost. It was where many of the original apostles had lived and ministered. For believers scattered across the Roman Empire, Jerusalem represented the birthplace of their faith. Yet, despite its spiritual importance, the church in Jerusalem appears to have faced serious economic hardship. Historians continue to debate the precise causes. Some point to famines that affected parts of the eastern Mediterranean during the first century. Others note the economic pressures that may have fallen upon Jewish believers who followed Jesus in a society where religious and social identities were deeply interconnected. Whatever the exact reasons, the evidence suggests that many Christians in Jerusalem were experiencing genuine need. Paul viewed this situation through a lens far broader than charity alone. Throughout his ministry, he emphasized that the gospel had created a new people of God composed of both Jews and Gentiles. This conviction had already been tested during the controversy surrounding Titus's own identity as a Greek believer. Now, the question was no longer whether Gentiles could enter the family of faith. The question was whether they would act like family once they had entered. It is one thing to affirm unity in theory. It is another thing to demonstrate unity through sacrifice. Paul believed the collection for Jerusalem provided an opportunity to do exactly that. As he traveled throughout the Roman world, he encouraged Gentile churches to contribute financial support for the believers in Jerusalem. The project carried profound symbolic meaning. The gospel had first emerged from Jewish communities. Through the ministry of apostles and missionaries, that message had spread to Gentile populations throughout the empire. Now, those Gentile believers had an opportunity to express gratitude and solidarity toward the church from which the movement had originally grown. The collection, therefore, represented far more than economic assistance. It was a visible expression of mutual dependence and shared identity. It declared that Christians separated by culture and geography still belonged to one body. At this stage in the story, Titus once again emerges as a trusted figure, having successfully helped restore the relationship between Paul and the Corinthians. He was uniquely positioned to assist with this new undertaking. The assignment may appear less dramatic than the crisis in Corinth, but in many respects it required a different kind of leadership. Organizing financial contributions across multiple churches demanded accountability, trustworthiness, communication skills, and administrative competence. Any suspicion regarding the handling of resources could undermine the entire effort. Paul understood these risks well. Throughout his letters, he demonstrates careful concern for transparency and integrity. The credibility of the mission depended not only upon its purpose, but also upon how it was conducted. This helps explain why Titus played such an important role. By this point, his reputation was firmly established. He had proven himself trustworthy in situations involving conflict, doctrine, and leadership. Now, that same reputation would help strengthen confidence in a project involving significant resources. In 2 Corinthians, Paul speaks positively about Titus's enthusiasm for the collection. This detail is revealing because it highlights an important aspect of his character. Titus was not merely completing assignments out of obligation. He appears to have embraced the mission personally. He understood its deeper significance. The collection offered a practical way of demonstrating the unity that Paul had spent years preaching. Earlier, debates had focused on theological acceptance. This project focused on practical solidarity. The transition was important because mature communities are measured not only by what they believe but also by how they treat one another. The historical context makes the collection even more remarkable. The Roman Empire was a world deeply divided by ethnicity, status, class, and regional identity. Social boundaries often determined how people viewed one another. Loyalty was typically directed toward family, city, ethnic group, or political interests. The Christian movement challenged those assumptions by creating a new form of community that crossed traditional boundaries: Jews and Gentiles, wealthy and poor. Free citizens and slaves were increasingly encouraged to see one another as brothers and sisters in Christ. Such a vision was revolutionary. Yet, revolutionary ideas remain fragile unless supported by concrete action. The collection for Jerusalem became one of the earliest and most powerful examples of Christians putting that vision into practice. Another fascinating aspect of this chapter is the way it reflects Titus's own journey. Earlier in the story, he stood at the center of the debate concerning Gentile inclusion. His life had become evidence that non-Jews could belong fully within the people of God. Now, that same Gentile believer was helping coordinate support for Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. The symbolism is extraordinary. The very individual who once represented controversy was now helping strengthen unity. Titus embodied the transformation that Paul believed the gospel was producing throughout the Christian world. Former barriers were giving way to shared identity. Former divisions were being replaced by mutual responsibility. Through leaders like Titus, these theological ideals became visible realities. Historians often observe that successful movements require both visionaries and builders. Visionaries articulate great ideas. Builders transform those ideas into functioning realities. Throughout his life, Titus repeatedly appears in the role of builder. He helped strengthen relationships. He helped preserve unity. He helped organize practical expressions of faith. The collection for Jerusalem reveals this dimension of his leadership with particular clarity. He was not only capable of resolving problems, he was capable of creating connections between communities that might otherwise remain distant from one another. By the end of this mission, Titus had added another layer to an already impressive record of service. He had demonstrated theological reliability, relational wisdom, and organizational competence. Few leaders possessed all three qualities, yet an even greater responsibility still awaited him. Up to this point, Titus had largely operated as Paul's representative, assisting with specific missions and assignments. Soon that would change. A new challenge was emerging on an island known throughout the ancient world for its difficult reputation and complex social environment. There, Titus would move beyond the role of trusted envoy and step fully into the responsibilities of regional leadership. The assignment would test everything he had learned and reveal just how important he had become to the future of the early church. By the time the collection for Jerusalem was underway, Titus had already established himself as one of the most trusted leaders within the apostolic mission. He had stood beside Paul during a defining theological controversy. He had helped restore one of the most troubled churches in the Christian world. He had assisted in strengthening unity between Jewish and Gentile believers across the Roman Empire. Again and again, he had demonstrated reliability under pressure, yet everything that had come before was preparing him for a new responsibility, unlike any he had previously received. For the first time, Titus would not simply be sent to solve a problem or complete a specific assignment. He would be entrusted with the long-term development of churches across an entire region. That region was the island of Crete, situated in the eastern Mediterranean Sea, south of mainland Greece. Crete occupied a strategic position within the Roman world. For centuries, it had served as a crossroads of trade, migration, and cultural exchange. Long before the rise of Rome, the island had been home to the famous Minoan civilization, one of the earliest advanced societies in European history, by the 1st century. However, Crete existed as part of the Roman Empire, influenced by both Greek cultural traditions and Roman political structures. Its cities participated in Mediterranean commerce, its population reflected diverse influences, and its social life resembled that of many regions connected to the broader Greco-Roman world. From a missionary perspective, Crete presented significant opportunities. Wherever people gathered, traded, traveled, and exchanged ideas, the gospel could spread. Yet the island also presented unique difficulties. One of the most intriguing aspects of Crete's reputation comes from ancient sources themselves. Classical writers occasionally portrayed Cretans as people associated with dishonesty, political maneuvering, and moral inconsistency. Whether these stereotypes were fully deserved remains impossible to determine. Ancient authors often exaggerated the characteristics of particular regions. Nevertheless, the existence of such descriptions tells us something important. Crete was not generally viewed as a model of civic virtue within the Roman imagination. It possessed a reputation that outsiders frequently regarded with skepticism. This cultural background would create challenges for anyone attempting to build stable Christian communities. The New Testament provides only limited information regarding how Christianity first arrived in Crete. Some scholars suggest that visitors from Crete mentioned during Pentecost may have carried the message back to the island. Others propose that missionary activity during later decades contributed to the growth of local congregations. Whatever the precise sequence of events, by the time Titus arrived there, Christian communities already existed across various cities. The problem was not the absence of believers. The problem was that these churches needed structure, guidance, and long-term leadership. This distinction is important because it highlights a major transition occurring within early Christianity. The first phase of the Christian movement focused primarily on expansion. Apostles and missionaries traveled widely, proclaiming the gospel and establishing new communities. As those communities multiplied, however, a second challenge emerged. Growth alone was not enough. Churches needed stability. They needed leadership. They needed organization. They needed a framework capable of sustaining the faith beyond the lifetime of the apostles. Crete became one of the places where this challenge was especially visible. This explains why Paul's decision to leave Titus there was so significant. The assignment itself reveals the level of confidence Paul had developed in him over many years. Regional leadership required far more than theological knowledge. It required administrative ability, emotional maturity, practical wisdom, and the capacity to work with diverse groups of people. Unlike temporary missions that lasted weeks or months, this responsibility involved ongoing oversight of multiple congregations spread across the island. Titus was expected to help guide an entire network of churches toward greater stability and maturity. Historians often observe that building institutions is more difficult than launching movements. Inspiration can create momentum, but sustaining that momentum requires structure. The early church was beginning to face this reality. Many communities had been founded through the energy and sacrifice of traveling missionaries, yet missionary success alone could not guarantee long-term survival. Without capable leadership, churches could become vulnerable to confusion, division, and stagnation. Titus's work in Crete placed him directly at the center of this critical stage of development. Another fascinating aspect of the Cretan mission is that it reveals how Christianity adapted to different cultural environments. The church did not spread into a single uniform society. It entered cities, provinces, and regions with distinct customs, traditions, and social expectations. Leaders needed wisdom to preserve the core message of the gospel while helping believers navigate local realities. What worked in Jerusalem might not work in Corinth. What worked in Corinth might not work in Crete. Effective leadership required discernment. Titus had already demonstrated that ability in previous assignments. Now, he would need it on a larger scale than ever before. In many respects, Crete represented the culmination of everything Titus had learned throughout his ministry. The controversy over circumcision taught him the importance of theological clarity. The crisis in Corinth taught him the importance of relational wisdom. The collection for Jerusalem taught him the importance of unity across cultural boundaries. Each experience prepared him for the responsibilities now before him. He was no longer simply assisting the mission. He was helping shape its future. For this reason, the assignment to Crete marks one of the most important transitions in the entire story of Titus. Earlier chapters focused on how he earned Paul's trust. This chapter reveals what that trust ultimately led to. Titus had become a leader capable of carrying significant responsibility in his own right. He was no longer merely a representative sent to execute instructions. He was becoming one of the principal builders of the post-apostolic church. Yet the challenges awaiting him on Crete were substantial. Establishing stable congregations required more than good intentions. Churches needed qualified leadership. Communities needed clear standards. Believers needed practical guidance for living out their faith within a complex society. The task demanded careful organization and deliberate planning. Recognizing this need, Paul would soon provide Titus with detailed instructions designed to help transform scattered congregations into healthy and enduring churches. Those instructions, preserved in the letter that bears Titus's name, would become one of the most influential documents on Christian leadership ever written, and would ensure that Titus's impact extended far beyond the island where he served. When Titus arrived in Crete, he entered a stage of ministry fundamentally different from anything he had faced before. Earlier assignments had focused on resolving crises, strengthening relationships, and carrying out specific missions on behalf of Paul. Crete required something else entirely. The churches scattered across the island needed long-term stability. They needed organization. They needed leadership capable of guiding communities beyond the pioneering phase of Christian expansion. In many ways, the future of these congregations would depend less on dramatic missionary breakthroughs and more on the quiet, difficult work of building healthy institutions. Recognizing this reality, Paul sent Titus a letter that would become one of the most influential leadership documents in Christian history. Today, It is known simply as the Epistle to Titus. To understand why this letter matters so much, we must appreciate the historical moment in which it was written. The Christian movement was beginning to transition from its founding generation into a more structured phase of development. The apostles could not remain everywhere at once. Churches were appearing across vast regions of the Roman Empire. New believers needed instruction. Communities needed guidance. Local leaders needed to be identified and prepared for responsibility. Without these foundations, many congregations might struggle to survive once the original missionaries moved on. The letter to Titus therefore addresses one of the most important questions facing the early church. How can a growing movement preserve its identity and mission across multiple generations? Paul's answer begins with leadership. One of the first priorities outlined in the letter is the appointment of elders in the churches of Crete. This instruction reveals a crucial reality about early Christianity. Healthy communities do not emerge automatically. They require capable leaders who can guide, teach, encourage, and model the values of the faith. Yet, what is most striking about Paul's instructions is not the existence of leadership positions. It is the criteria used to evaluate potential leaders. Modern societies often associate leadership with charisma, influence, education, or public visibility. Paul's emphasis is noticeably different, again and again. The qualifications focus on character. Leaders were expected to demonstrate integrity, self-control, faithfulness, discipline, hospitality, and moral consistency. This focus reflects a profound principle within early Christian thought. Leadership was not primarily about power. It was about example. The credibility of the church depended significantly upon the lives of those entrusted with responsibility. A leader whose conduct contradicted the message of the gospel could undermine the entire community. For that reason, Titus was not simply instructed to appoint leaders. He was instructed to identify individuals whose lives reflected the transformation Christianity claimed to produce. This responsibility required discernment. It required patience. It required the ability to evaluate not only a person's abilities, but also their character. Historians often note that one of the greatest challenges facing any growing movement is succession. Founders may inspire extraordinary loyalty, but future generations need structures capable of preserving the original vision. The letter to Titus addresses precisely this challenge. Paul understood that the long-term future of Christianity depended upon raising leaders who could faithfully continue the work after the apostles were gone. Titus became one of the key figures entrusted with that task. The letter also reveals an important shift in the role Titus himself was playing. Earlier in his life, he had often functioned as a representative carrying Paul's authority into specific situations. In Crete, however, he was responsible for helping establish leadership across an entire region. This distinction matters because it demonstrates the extent of his development. Titus was no longer simply assisting the mission. He was helping shape the structures through which the mission would continue into the future. In many respects, he had become one of the architects of the post-apostolic church. Another fascinating feature of the letter is its emphasis on community life. Paul understood that churches were not merely collections of individuals who shared certain beliefs. They were communities whose daily relationships either strengthened or weakened their witness. For this reason, the letter contains guidance directed toward different groups within the church: older men, older women, younger men, younger women, and households all receive practical instruction. This focus reveals that Christianity was not intended to remain an abstract philosophy. It was designed to shape ordinary life. The health of a church depended not only upon what its members believed, but also upon how they treated one another, how they conducted themselves, and how they interacted with the wider society. This concern was especially important within the environment of Crete. As we saw in the previous chapter, The island possessed a reputation that many ancient writers viewed negatively. Whether entirely justified or not, such perceptions created a challenge for Christian communities. Their witness would be judged not only by their teachings but also by their behavior. Paul, therefore, encouraged a model of leadership capable of cultivating communities known for integrity, responsibility, and good conduct. In this sense, the letter to Titus presents leadership as a form of discipleship. Leaders were expected to guide others not merely through instruction but through example. Their lives were intended to demonstrate what the gospel looked like in practice. Another important aspect of the letter involves its understanding of authority. In the modern world, authority is often associated with control or status. The New Testament presents a different vision. Authority existed for the purpose of service, protection, and spiritual growth. Leaders were entrusted with responsibility because communities required guidance. The goal was not personal advancement, but communal health. Titus's assignment reflects this principle clearly. His authority in Crete was not given for his own benefit. It was given so that churches could become stronger, more stable, and more capable of fulfilling their mission. The broader historical significance of this chapter should not be underestimated. Much of what later generations would recognize as church leadership has roots in the principles outlined within this letter. Across centuries and cultures, Christians have returned to these instructions when considering questions of character, responsibility, and pastoral leadership. Whether one agrees with every interpretation that has emerged from the text, its influence on Christian history is undeniable. Through Titus, we gain a unique glimpse into how the earliest believers sought to preserve the integrity of their communities while preparing for the future. Yet, the letter was not written solely to establish leadership structures. There was another reason these instructions were urgently needed. Healthy leaders were essential because unhealthy influences were already threatening the churches. Ideas capable of creating confusion and division were spreading within some communities. If the churches of Crete were to survive and flourish, they would need more than organization. They would need protection. And that challenge would lead Titus into one of the most important battles of his ministry. A battle not fought with weapons or political power, but with truth, discernment, and the defense of sound teaching. The instructions Paul gave Titus regarding church leadership were not created in a vacuum. They were a response to a very real danger already affecting the churches of Crete. Healthy leaders were needed because unhealthy influences were spreading. Strong foundations were necessary because competing voices were attempting to shape the future of Christian communities. This reality forms the backdrop of one of the most important aspects of Titus's ministry. Beyond organizing churches and appointing leaders, he was tasked with protecting the integrity of the faith itself. In the first century, Christianity existed within a world overflowing with religious ideas, philosophical systems, cultural traditions, and competing claims to truth. The gospel was spreading rapidly, but it was also encountering powerful pressures from every direction. As a result, questions about doctrine were never merely academic. They carried profound consequences for the life and future of the church. Modern readers sometimes imagine false teachers as obviously deceptive figures whose errors would have been immediately apparent. The historical reality was often far more complicated. Most dangerous teachings did not arrive by openly rejecting Christianity. Instead, they frequently emerged through distortion, mixture, or exaggeration. Individuals would combine elements of Christian belief with other traditions, philosophies, or personal interpretations. Certain truths might be emphasized while others were ignored. Important doctrines could be altered subtly rather than denied outright. This made discernment extremely difficult, especially within young congregations still learning the foundations of the faith. The churches of Crete faced precisely this challenge. Paul's letter provides several clues about the nature of the problem. Although scholars continued to debate the exact identity of the teachers involved, the text suggests that some individuals were promoting speculative ideas, engaging in fruitless controversies, and encouraging disputes that produced confusion rather than spiritual growth. Others appear to have been preoccupied with arguments concerning genealogies, traditions, and interpretations of religious regulations. The details remain partially uncertain, but the broader picture is clear. These teachings were distracting believers from the central message of the gospel and creating instability within the churches. Paul's concern was not simply that people were disagreeing. Disagreement existed throughout the ancient world and continues to exist today. His concern was that certain teachings were producing unhealthy results. This distinction is important because it reveals how the early church evaluated doctrine. Truth was not viewed merely as an intellectual exercise. Beliefs and behavior were closely connected. Ideas shaped communities. What people believed influenced how they lived, how they treated one another, and how they understood their relationship with God. For Paul, protecting sound doctrine was therefore an act of pastoral care. It was about preserving the spiritual health of believers. This explains why the language of the letter becomes unusually direct when addressing false teachers. Paul viewed the issue as serious because the consequences were serious. Churches could be divided. Families could be confused. New believers could be misled. The mission itself could be weakened. Titus was expected to confront these dangers with both courage and wisdom. Yet the challenge was not simply to silence opposing voices. The challenge was to guide communities toward truth without creating unnecessary conflict. This required a delicate balance throughout his ministry. Titus had repeatedly demonstrated the ability to navigate difficult situations. In Corinth, he had helped restore relationships rather than deepen divisions. In the collection for Jerusalem, he had strengthened unity across cultural boundaries. Now, those same leadership qualities would be tested in a different context. The battle in Crete was not primarily relational or organizational. It was intellectual and spiritual. Titus needed to help believers distinguish between teachings that strengthened their faith and teachings that undermined it. One of the most fascinating aspects of this chapter is the way it reveals the early Christian understanding of doctrinal health. Paul repeatedly emphasizes what he calls sound teaching. The language is significant. The word sound carries the idea of health, wholeness, and proper functioning. Just as a healthy body operates as it should, healthy doctrine supports the growth and well-being of a Christian community. Conversely, unhealthy teaching acts like a disease. It spreads confusion, weakens faith, and creates instability. This medical imagery appears frequently throughout early Christian writings and reflects a practical understanding of theology. Doctrine mattered because it affected real lives. Historians often point out that every expanding movement faces a challenge similar to the one confronting Titus. Growth brings diversity. Diversity introduces new perspectives. New perspectives create debates about identity and direction. The question then becomes how a movement preserves its essential convictions while continuing to expand into new environments. Christianity faced this challenge almost immediately. As the gospel spread across the Roman Empire, it encountered countless cultural influences and intellectual traditions. Some enriched Christian understanding. Others threatened to reshape it in ways that departed from apostolic teaching. Leaders like Titus played a crucial role in helping churches navigate this process. Another important feature of Paul's instructions is that they emphasize discernment rather than fear. The goal was not to isolate believers from every competing idea. Such isolation would have been impossible within the interconnected world of the Roman Empire. Instead, believers needed the ability to evaluate teachings carefully. They needed leaders capable of distinguishing between truth and error. They needed confidence in the gospel's core message. Titus was responsible for helping cultivate that confidence. His task was not merely defensive, it was constructive. He was helping build communities rooted deeply enough in Christian truth to withstand confusion when it appeared. This chapter also highlights how far Titus himself had progressed since the beginning of the story. Earlier, he had been the subject of a theological controversy. Others debated whether a Gentile like him could fully belong within God's people. Now, he had become one of the individuals entrusted with defending the faith and guiding churches through doctrinal challenges. The transformation is remarkable. Titus had moved from being a test case for the future of Christianity to becoming one of its guardians. His life embodied the very principles he was now called to protect. By this stage, he stood as a mature leader whose judgment carried significant weight throughout the Christian movement. Yet despite the importance of his work in Crete, time continued moving forward. The apostolic era was gradually approaching its conclusion. Paul himself was entering the final chapter of his ministry. The generation that had witnessed the earliest expansion of Christianity was beginning to pass from the scene. As the years advanced, the historical record surrounding Titus would become increasingly sparse. The man who had helped shape some of the most important developments in the early church would gradually fade from view. Only a few final clues would remain, leaving later generations to piece together the closing chapter of a remarkable life. After years of appearing at some of the most important turning points in early Christian history, Titus begins to disappear from the historical record. This disappearance is not dramatic. There is no final speech, no farewell scene, no account of martyrdom preserved in Scripture. Instead, the evidence simply grows quieter. The man who had stood beside Paul during theological controversies, restored damaged churches, strengthened unity between believers, and helped establish leadership structures across Crete gradually fades from view. For historians, this creates both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge is obvious. We would like to know how the story ends. The opportunity is more subtle. The silence surrounding Titus allows us to explore how ancient history is reconstructed, and why so many influential figures vanish from the surviving sources despite their undeniable importance. The final, undisputed reference to Titus in the New Testament appears in 2 Timothy. The setting is significant. Paul is nearing the end of his life. The tone of the letter differs from many of his earlier writings. There is a sense of reflection, urgency, and awareness that his ministry is approaching its conclusion. He speaks about companions who have departed for various regions. He mentions co-workers serving in different places. Within this context, Paul briefly states that Titus has gone to Dalmatia. The reference is remarkably short. In fact, it occupies only a few words. Yet those few words tell us several important things. First, Titus was still actively involved in ministry during the final phase of Paul's life. Second, he continued serving beyond Crete, suggesting that his responsibilities extended across multiple regions of the Roman world. Third, Paul's mention of him carries no hint of conflict or concern. Unlike certain individuals criticized elsewhere in the letters, Titus appears to remain a trusted co-worker until the very end. Beyond this brief statement, however, the biblical trail effectively ends. For many readers, this feels surprising. After all, Titus played a role in some of the most significant developments of the apostolic age. Why do we know so little about his final years? The answer lies partly in the nature of ancient historical sources themselves. Modern audiences often expect biographies to provide detailed accounts from birth to death. Ancient writers operated differently. Their goal was not always to preserve comprehensive life stories. They wrote for specific purposes. addressing particular audiences and concerns. As a result, many individuals who were undoubtedly important in their own time appear only briefly in surviving records. Titus is far from unique in this respect. Numerous figures from the 1st century emerge clearly for a period and then disappear from documentation altogether. Historians refer to this problem as the challenge of historical reconstruction. We can only work with the evidence that survives. Missing information does not necessarily mean an individual stopped being influential. More often, it means the documents that might have preserved additional details were never written, were lost, or simply failed to survive the passage of time. The ancient world was not designed to preserve information with the efficiency of the modern era. Manuscripts deteriorated. Libraries were destroyed. Wars, natural disasters, and ordinary neglect caused countless records to vanish. Even many major historical figures are known only through fragments. In that sense, the limited evidence surrounding Titus reflects a broader reality of ancient history, rather than an unusual exception. This perspective helps explain why scholars exercise caution when discussing his later years. The New Testament allows us to establish certain facts with reasonable confidence. Titus was a Gentile convert. He became one of Paul's most trusted co-workers. He participated in the controversy over circumcision. He played a major role in the Corinthian reconciliation. He assisted with the collection for Jerusalem. He led churches in Crete. He later traveled to Dalmatia. Beyond those points, certainty becomes increasingly difficult, yet human curiosity rarely tolerates silence. As the centuries passed, Christians naturally wondered what happened next. Various traditions emerged attempting to answer the question. Some associated Titus with continued ministry in Crete. Others described him as a long-serving leader among the churches there. A number of later sources even offered details concerning his death. These traditions are valuable because they reveal how later generations remembered Titus. However, they must be approached carefully. Historical value and historical certainty are not always the same thing. Responsible scholarship distinguishes between information supported directly by early evidence and traditions that developed over time. This distinction is not a weakness. In fact, it is one of the strengths of serious historical investigation. Admitting uncertainty where uncertainty exists protects the integrity of the story. Interestingly, the disappearance of Titus from the record may itself reveal something important about his character. Throughout the narrative of his life, Titus consistently appears as a servant of the mission, rather than a seeker of personal recognition. He enters difficult situations. He strengthens communities. He solves problems. Then he moves on. The spotlight rarely remains on him for long. Unlike some figures who become famous through public speeches or dramatic events, Titus built much of his influence through faithful service behind the scenes. The silence surrounding his final years almost feels consistent with the pattern established throughout his life. He remained focused on the work rather than on preserving his own legacy. There is also a broader historical lesson hidden within this chapter. Many of the people who shape history most deeply are not always those whose names dominate the surviving records. Large movements depend upon countless individuals whose contributions become woven into institutions, communities, and traditions rather than into biographies. Early Christianity certainly had famous leaders, but it also depended upon people like Titus. These were individuals who translated vision into reality, strengthened fragile communities, and ensured that the mission continued beyond the first generation. Their influence often exceeded the amount of attention they received. By the time we reach the final references to Titus, another transition is becoming visible. The apostolic era itself is drawing toward its conclusion. Paul is nearing the end of his ministry. The generation that personally witnessed the earliest expansion of Christianity is gradually passing from the scene. The future of the church will increasingly rest in the hands of leaders shaped by their example. Titus belongs to that transitional generation. He serves as a bridge between the founding apostles and the communities that would carry Christianity into the centuries ahead. In many ways, that may be the most important clue left behind by the silence. The story no longer centers on a single individual. It centers on a movement continuing beyond him. Yet, before we leave Titus entirely, one final question remains. How should we remember a man whose life shaped so many crucial moments while leaving behind so few personal details? The answer lies not in the mystery of his final years, but in the legacy created by everything that came before. And it is that legacy which forms the final chapter of his remarkable story. As we reach the end of Titus's story, something unusual becomes clear. Most biographies conclude by focusing on how a person died, where they were buried, or what happened during their final years. With Titus, we cannot do that. The historical record simply does not provide enough information. Yet perhaps that is fitting, because the true significance of Titus was never found in the details of his death. It was found in the kind of life he lived. The deeper we examine the surviving evidence, the more we discover that Titus represents a type of leadership that is often overlooked, both in history and in the modern world. He was not the founder of the Christian movement. He was not one of the 12 apostles. He was not a famous preacher whose speeches were preserved for future generations. He was something different. He was a builder. And without builders, even the greatest movements struggle to survive. One of the most striking aspects of Titus's life is how completely it challenges conventional ideas about influence. In many cultures, influence is associated with visibility. The most important people are assumed to be those who receive the most attention. The story of Titus points in the opposite direction. His name appears only a handful of times in the New Testament. Entire books of Scripture never mention him. Yet, when we trace the moments in which he does appear, a remarkable pattern emerges. Again and again, Titus is present when something essential to the future of Christianity is at stake. He appears during moments that determine whether the church will move forward or backward, unite or divide, mature or remain fragile. His influence was not measured by prominence. It was measured by responsibility. Another lesson emerges from the way Titus's life reflects the changing nature of the early Christian movement. At the beginning of his story, he stood as a symbol of a major theological question. Could a Gentile truly belong among the people of God without first becoming Jewish? For many believers in the first century, this was not a minor issue. It touched the very identity of the church. Titus's existence forced Christian leaders to confront that question directly. Yet, by the end of his life, the debate that once defined him had largely faded into the background. He was no longer known primarily as a Greek convert. He was known as a Christian leader. That transformation reveals one of the most powerful realities within the New Testament. The gospel was creating a new identity, capable of transcending ethnic, cultural, and social boundaries. Titus became living evidence that this vision was possible. His life demonstrated that leadership in the church was increasingly determined by faithfulness and character, rather than ancestry or status. There is also an important leadership lesson embedded within his story. Throughout the narrative, Titus repeatedly accepted assignments that carried significant responsibility but very little personal glory. He entered controversies that others preferred to avoid. He stepped into conflicts that could easily have damaged his reputation. He worked among churches facing difficult challenges. He accepted long-term responsibilities in regions requiring patience and perseverance. At no point do we see evidence that he pursued recognition for himself. Instead, he consistently focused on strengthening communities and advancing the mission entrusted to him. In a world increasingly fascinated by celebrity, Titus offers a radically different model of leadership. He reminds us that some of the most valuable work is often performed by people whose names rarely become famous. Another aspect of Titus's legacy involves the transition from movement to institution. Historians frequently observe that the most difficult stage in the life of any movement occurs after the initial excitement begins to fade. Founders inspire people. Pioneers create momentum. But sustaining that momentum requires organization, leadership development, and long-term vision. The early church faced exactly this challenge. Christianity was spreading rapidly across the Roman Empire. New congregations were appearing in diverse cultural settings. The apostles could not personally oversee every community forever. Someone needed to help build the structures that would allow the faith to survive into future generations. Titus became one of those individuals. His work in Crete illustrates this role particularly well. Rather than merely expanding the movement, he helped strengthen its foundations. In many ways, he represents the generation that ensured Christianity could continue after the apostolic era came to an end. The influence of Titus can also be seen in the enduring importance of the letter bearing his name. For nearly 2,000 years, Christians have returned to that document when discussing leadership, character, community life, and spiritual responsibility. The letter remains one of the clearest windows into how the early church understood the relationship between belief and behavior. Through Titus, later generations gained insight into the practical challenges facing Christian communities during the first century. His ministry became part of the foundation upon which countless churches would build. Yet perhaps the most profound aspect of Titus's legacy lies in what his story reveals about success itself. Modern culture often measures success through wealth, recognition, power, or personal achievement. The New Testament frequently measures success differently. It focuses on faithfulness. By that standard, Titus stands as an extraordinary example. The surviving evidence never portrays him as the most gifted speaker, the most influential public figure, or the most celebrated leader of his generation. Instead, it consistently portrays him as dependable. Whenever difficult responsibilities emerged, he could be trusted. Whenever churches required guidance, he could be trusted. Whenever unity needed strengthening, he could be trusted. Faithfulness became the defining characteristic of his life. That may explain why Paul placed such confidence in him over the years. Trust is not built through a single dramatic moment. It is built through repeated acts of reliability over time. Titus earned that trust, and his story demonstrates the lasting impact of a life shaped by it. Looking back across the entire narrative, we can see that Titus's journey mirrors the larger journey of Christianity itself. He began as an outsider, entering a movement rooted in Jewish tradition. He became part of the debate over how far the gospel would reach. He participated in the process through which Christianity expanded beyond ethnic boundaries and developed into a faith for all nations. He helped preserve unity during times of conflict. He contributed to the formation of stable Christian communities. He belonged to the generation that carried the faith from its earliest beginnings toward its future expansion across the world. In that sense, Titus's story is not merely about one man. It is about the transformation of Christianity from a small movement within first-century Judaism into a growing international community. Perhaps that is why his life remains so relevant today. The world continues to need leaders who value service above recognition, faithfulness above fame, and responsibility above status. The world continues to need people willing to strengthen communities rather than simply seek attention. Titus embodied those qualities. He may never have achieved the fame of Peter or Paul, but the evidence suggests that the early church would have been far weaker without leaders like him, and that is ultimately the legacy of Titus. Not a legacy of visibility, but a legacy of faithfulness. Not a legacy of personal glory, but a legacy of service. Not a legacy built upon being remembered, but a legacy built upon helping something far greater than himself endure.